And then we also have the UK Shadow Secretary of Business and Trade, Jonathan Reynolds. So I want to welcome them all here today. Okay, we're going to start with some practical views from the ground. So I'm going to start with you, Roland. We know Germany's made some efforts to de-risk from China. What steps is that prompting Siemens to take in response?
Well, let me set the frame. I mean, the German's operating model is, of course, technology. We are industrialized country. We are living on export. And living in the midst of a transformation, obviously. This transformation is triggered by, we call it mega trends, which is, I mean, climate change or taking care about using less resources. It's urbanization. It's aging societies, which is a big topic, labor markets. It's another one which we call globalization. We used to call it globalization. It's now globalization, which is all about increasing resilience. Actually, we believe that the world's operating model is somehow broken, which was about low labor cost arbitrage. So put everything in manufacture at one place, and this is over-optimized. So this has to be somehow pulled back. And the last one is digitalization, which is rolled into everything. So what's happening now is that this is a huge transformation. And in Germany, the energy price goes up because we don't have the cheap gas from Russia anymore, and this will stay. So all energy-intensive industries are under dispute. The other one is how can we maintain export in a localized world. So the next one is about innovation, digitalization. How can we, as fast as possible, get access to this technology in order to drive innovation and maintain our industry. So point is that, and now I make it rather short, I do believe that in Europe/Germany we are over-regulating. So this is really throttling innovation. I mean, just name the AI Act, the Data Act, Cybersecurity Act. It's derived from a B2C business model, rolled into a B2B business model, and that doesn't just help. So that's one problem. The other problem is, talking about the energy transformation, what happens is that we are going from an OPEX-based model, build a cheap power plant and buy fuel later on, into a CAPEX-based model. It's all about renewables. This is CAPEX front-loading. So how can governments help in order to front load, including all the infrastructure needs, the grids? So rather than thinking about how to set the frame on providing infrastructure and see how we can use that one in terms of subsidies, you should not subsidize particular technologies. So this is another problem. So don't do that. Let the market decide, but set the frame what you want to achieve. So this is happening. I think we're over-regulating. But at the same time, I do believe there's a substantial strength of the industrial strength, small and medium-sized enterprises, which helps us. So it's a fine balance, but transformation happens, and things have to change.
Well, on that note, Minister, I mean, you must be speaking to business leaders. How are you approaching the policies you want to bring in Saudi Arabia?
Well, thank you for having me. First of all, I have a solution for most of your problems. So.
Perfect.
We should talk.
Well, for us in Saudi, I mean, the whole essence of our Vision 2030 is diversifying the economy, making it more complex. So probably many people think that Saudi Arabia has a lot of protective policies, which is not the case. Today, our average custom duty is less than 4.5%. And therefore, it's an open market today. Whatever we produce in Saudi is actually globally competitive. But what we are trying to do is really diversify our offering of the different sectors. We are trying to give also Saudi Arabia its share, a fair share of different capabilities that needs to be built. So our policies are actually three-dimensional, and one is really the overarching policy that's geared towards making the environment of investment an environment that is clear, transparent, competitive. We don't, as Roland rightly said, we don't try to support certain sectors indefinitely or spoil them. So that's the overarching. And then we have probably the other dimension is looking at how can we accelerate some of the things that we want to happen faster. So like energy transition, like automation and technology, human capital development, And these are also cross-cutting, because one is to solve them, you solve them for all. And the other side, the third probably angle or third dimension is looking at the different sectors that we are trying to build. So automotive, what can we do to help a complete automotive cluster to be built? In pharmaceuticals, the same thing, and so on. So I think this three-dimensional way of looking at policy making is helping us also create the right policies that will address the right balance between the interest of the nation, trying to maximize the added value, getting the best out of our natural resources, but most importantly, allowing for investors to come and invest for a long term. The sector, as Roland also mentioned, it's a high investment sector. It's a capital intensive. It needs a very long view how to look. So it's a long play. And the same thing also with mining. How can we integrate mining as a resource with the industrial sector? We want to create the right enablers to ensure that we do not fall on the trap of others who've done mining before, where the resources are being moved from the country to be processed elsewhere. So these are the kind of general policies that, and then I think the framework of policy making then need to address the challenges that happen as you know, like what is happening today in the Red Sea. Or these are things that we need also to build in the policy framework so that governments can react quickly, because we cannot predict the future, but we need to be ready.
So, Jonathan, you'll notice that nowhere included in that was de-risking from China. But your government, according to the polls, your party, sorry, could be in government soon. So how much is the new Labor going to intervene with policies that could reshape business and trade?
Well, first of all, we will have an explicit industrial strategy, so that is obviously a significant difference to the UK at the moment, and part of that is about the traditional objectives of any industrial policy, so growth, productivity, the regional distribution across the country of there. But I do think the two earlier contributions highlight one of two areas which is something additional to maybe how this debate has changed compared to sort of the relatively recent past. One is about de-risking. I mean, I think the events of Ukraine and the pandemic, what we now see in the Red Sea, that kind of question about the resilience of supply chains alongside their diversification is part of that. That isn't just about, though, I think, supply chains. I mean, it's partly about public policy too. In the UK, for instance, we're not exposed to significant quantities of Russian gas, but of course our electricity price is set by the gas price, and therefore, you know, the impact of that crisis was particularly significant. I think the bit that hasn't yet been mentioned, which is perhaps the most advanced in terms of the discussion of public policy in the United States, is about how net zero is achieved and managed. And I think this is obviously something in the UK we've not really got into to the same degree in the past, but it is, I think, it's just essential as a politician to understand that the success or otherwise of decarbonisation is partly about public consent and about the need for that to be just and equitable. And I think a recognition that traditional concepts of policy being based just on what is fastest or cheapest, you know, in the main obviously has a direct relationship to policy around China, that will not carry the degree of public support that is necessary. I think that's fundamentally where the United States has got to ahead of a lot of European countries. It doesn't mean you are getting back to, you know, an old-fashioned sense of protectionism or about the state picking winners, as a phrase that's often associated with the 1970s in the UK. But it's got to be understood that to deliver the level of public consent for what I think we all want to see, you've got to do that in a way which works for people. There's a tremendous set of opportunities and new technologies, in you know, capex opportunities. Working people have to have a share of that. They have to do that. And I think good public policy around industrial policy today fundamentally has that at its heart.
So how much would you limit China's influence in Britain? I mean, following in the US footsteps to such a degree, is that going to be part of your policy?
Well, I think you've got to have heed to the sophistication of the debates. Of course, you have a very set of assertive policy measures in the US around China. You also see bilateral trade between the US and China to be at record levels. So it's not necessarily about closing something off, but I think the recognition that there are sensitive areas that need to be protected, and that, for instance, to take the United Kingdom, which is in the main a services-based economy but with significant manufacturing, if the transition in the United Kingdom was seen to simply be about outsourcing emissions to other countries and reducing them in that way, rather than a public-private collaboration in the transition, I think that would severely undermine. We say in the UK, if decarbonisation was about deindustrialisation, I just do not think it would carry the consent of working people. So it's not about essentially approaching it from the view of limiting the relationship with any one country, but getting a fair and equitable set of policy measures which ensure that those dangers aren't met.
Okay, well, we've circled around the big elephant in the room, so now I'm going to go to the American economists. Laura,
we're not making it.
When it comes to competitiveness versus global cooperation, we've seen massive investments in the US, the IRA and also chip reshoring. Is it possible for there to be cooperation when you've got such a big player bringing everyone into its tent?
So I want to start a little bit with the goals behind industrial policy, and then to say that I think there is room for cooperation, and I actually think that U.S. legislation allows for cooperation. So the goals here are really, they're two really quite separate goals. There are national security goals associated with semiconductors. Semiconductors, it's like, if you think about it, it's like oil, it's essential to the digital economy going forward. If you look at the global structure of the semiconductor industry, you are shocked to find that almost all of the advanced chips in the world are produced in one place, in Taipei. And there's only one producer of the manufacturing equipment, and that's in the Netherlands. So basically, is that a competitive market structure? Does that make any sense? How did we get here? And we've got to do something about it, okay? Now, that is a global, you could say that's a global issue. We need a competitive, resilient, sustainable semiconductor global industry, okay? And look, I think what the U.S. is doing here is we're saying, you want to be part of that, come to the United States and build the facilities here. So the preference in the policy is where you locate your investment. It's not choosing U.S. winners. It's not saying it's this company, it's that company. So basically, I really want to say here, it's really to try to create additional competition and supply. The preferential part of it is to say, in order to get these subsidies, in order to participate in the microelectronics complex that DoD is developing, you need to be in the U.S., but you can be foreign, except you cannot be, and this is where the China issue comes in, you cannot be a Chinese company. Okay, that's not, because the national security threat in semiconductors is viewed by the United States to be a China threat. So let me go to the second area of industrial policy, which is really quite different. And that is to say, we want to build a strong green industry, products and services. We want to accelerate action to net zero. We want to give incentives to the private sector to accelerate investment to get to net zero. Again, most of the form of this is taking tax incentives. That's what the U.S. Congress is capable of enacting. We don't have a lot of grants, a lot of funds, a lot of investment support. We just have a lot of tax incentives. And again, the tax incentives are available for production in the United States. So you don't have to be a U.S. company. Now, in that sense, what I would say is the U.S. policy is really trying to build more competitive global industries to accelerate the R&D. There's a lot of R&D money in this. And a lot of the R&D money is available to companies, and a lot of the knowledge coming out of science will be available to companies. So I actually think it can be global. And the U.S. has backed off correctly. In some of the initial IRA stuff, it really was not only did you have to produce in the United States, but you had to be a domestic content by a domestic supplier. The U.S. has gotten rid of most of that stuff at the response to Europe, which correctly said, wait a minute, wait, that is really preferring not just U.S. as a production place, but U.S. companies. And the U.S. has backed off of that. So I think they're wise decisions. I think industrial policy, just let me end with an economist's view. Economists in general don't like industrial policy because they say, well, markets will figure it out. And if markets haven't figured it out, why should government do that? But think about these two cases. In the case of semiconductors, this is a national security issue, ultimately. And markets don't pay attention to national security issues. They don't. Governments pay attention to national security issues. Let's go to green net zero. We don't have carbon priced correctly in the world. We really don't have enough incentives to accelerate action in the market to get to net zero. So what the government is trying to do is say, all right, here are some additional incentives to move faster, And I think until, and we're not going to get it, we correctly priced carbon in the world, the private sector's decisions about this cannot reflect adequately the externality that the industrial policy is trying to adjust to.
Now, Adam, I've read a couple of editorials by you, and I know that you disagree on some of Laura's points. And I believe you may even have a baseball analogy in which to explain this, which I will do some interpretation for those who are not American if needed.
I was hoping we could spare our international audience that. Thank you for having me and to be here with this panel and this great group. So I'm not going to go cosmic and say industrial policy is terrible. Industrial policy has been around off and on for a very long time, and sometimes it's coincided with success and sometimes not. And a lot of the devil's in the details, as was depicted in all four of the preceding speakers. What I want to do is raise a couple cautions about things that I think the U.S. thrust and a lot of what Germany, Europe, UK, others have done in response to U.S. thrust, I think overlooks. And there are some ways, ideally, the industrial policy might be further adapted to make it better. So the first point is, in terms of getting to net zero, I think we need to talk about not just the creation and literal production of new green technologies. We need to think also about their adoption and spread. What matters for productivity growth, but what matters particularly for green growth, is that it's not just, as Germany's already doing, for example, leading the way in its own country. You need the developing world. You need the large masses of population, including China. You need all these places to adopt the policy and to adopt the new technologies. And I worry that some of the measures being undertaken with industrial policy as it's currently being practiced will encourage natural incentives to have companies be sort of national champions and then say, well, and then politicians saying, well, we put all this money, whether through tax credits or subsidies or whatever, into these particular companies. So, of course, we want the American or the German or the British or the Chinese company to triumph in selling their technology to the rest of the world. And that's perfectly understandable, but it's probably counterproductive for getting things priced well for the developing world, for getting common standards across the world, for getting rapid deployment. And I was very traumatized watching what happened with vaccines, that, the Chinese party decided they would sacrifice the well-being of their own people so that they would not be buying an American vaccine. And the Americans' vaccines were not properly, in my view, disseminated across Africa and South Asia as rapidly or as well as they could have been. Again, because Pfizer and Moderna and all these people working wonderful R&D had conflicting incentives. So I think one of the things we need to think about as we go forward is, in addition to these industrial policies, thinking about the diffusion and adoption and maintaining standards and interoperability, so it's not just in the worst case, I'm not saying this is necessarily what's going to happen, but in the worst case, China saying, if you're my friend, you buy my green technology, U.S. saying, if you're my friend, you buy my green technology, and this becomes another political football. Yeah. The second caution I just want to raise, and again, it's not absolutely inherent, but it is a recurrent problem, again, with this sort of national champions dynamic, is corruption. And I'm not suggesting that the Biden administration is corrupt. I know many of those people. I do not believe they're corrupt. And I'm not suggesting most private companies are corrupt. But what you do see is when a company is in a favored position and has, you know, the manufacturing lives and the political livelihood of a government in a democracy is seen as, do we keep this plant open in this place? They use that as leverage. And that can be very perverting. And I don't mean in a small way. I'm going to name a company that Boeing still exists. Laura Tyson played an enormous role, frankly, in the creation of Airbus, and because she helped us think about the fact there wasn't a competition for large airframe makers, and she's absolutely right. And the fact that we have 2 large airframe, maybe soon 3, is a good thing for the world, and I agree with that. But we've ended up in a world where Boeing, frankly, is engaged in moral hazard the way a too-big-to-fail bank is.
Yeah, yeah.
They know no one's going to shut them down. They know that they're too important to the U.S. economy and military and all these things, and so they're not held to account for the recurrent safety failures. So, again, it's not so much that industrial policy, the free market, serves these purposes. I completely agree with many of the comments made here, and we definitely need constructive public investment. I worry about some of the ignoring the international aspects in terms of the competitive dynamics and what that does to the spread of technology, and I worry that we get locked into too much pandering to the company. I'd rather have a little more arm's length, frankly, public sector investing, public sector setting standards, and then backing off.
So let's take those 2 up. Like, first one, the national champions. I'm going to address that to you, Roland. Do you feel like a national champion of Germany? Is that where you're focused? Are you wearing the vest when you go out on the field and have the discussions here?
Well, I mean, I don't know whether the question of being national champion or not, because I do believe more and more the economies are working and the industries are working more in ecosystems, because, I mean, I talked about digitalization and new technologies. Mm-hmm. There's no company in the world who can rock it alone. No. You need a technology stack, so we need partners, and that's what we are doing, right? Partnering with tech companies, the large ones, the small ones, in order to enrich our own technology to really make it happen, and this is so important. And this is, by the way, one of the changes which we see also in Germany. We come from the traditional ecosystem, which is tier 3 to delivers to tier 2, to tier 1, to OEMs, and they supply. It's more about platform-based, multi-sided ecosystems, which are so powerful. So we need that. Here comes the point, and you have a good point. It's a thin line. And you have 2 dimensions which are somehow controversial. One is, obviously, we want technologies to scale as fast as possible, as global, in order to save the problems we have. Mm-hmm. Climate change, feeding 8 billion people, and also healthcare systems, which are just running out of cost. The other side is technological sovereignty, which says, I mean, I want to sit on my technology, and I know that this gives me a competitive edge against another country who is eventually competing. So this is a big question we have to solve, and you brought it to the point. For me, when people talk about it's insane that Germany was running in such a dependency on Russian gas. Yeah, it's true. This dependency on the high-performance nodes of semiconductors on basically one company in one place, this is completely insane. So we have to change that. This brings me to my first point about the resilience, the over-optimization. For whatever reason, I think it was a monetary reason, which was because resilience didn't get any credits in the capital market, and so on and so on. So that we have to change, obviously, and the same holds true for for climate change, because we don't have, unfortunately, a global CO2 price, which would solve big, big problems, because then you have a calibration and say, and there is a price for CO2. I mean, just look at what happens. So this is the situation where we're in, and therefore I do believe it's a fine balance to see how we can do. And what governments in terms of policies they should do is they provide basically means in order to reallocate the way how we are using resources. Also, what you said, digging out resources and sending it to another place, so all the jobs are created in different places. What Indonesia does, for example, they say have a regulation in order to add local value. That's all fine if you don't overdo it, so that you're not replacing one dependency on another one. So that's the complicated game.
Well, the second point that was brought up was corruption. So I'm going to turn to our two government people right now. How are you ensuring that you're building that in when you are building industrial policy? I'll turn to you first, Minister.
Well, it's all about transparency, and I agree with the comment with regards to national champions. If they exist, they should exist to be role models of different activities, promote good standards. I mean, if I look at Aramco in Saudi Arabia, for example, it's been a blessing for the country rather than a liability towards how it just created a complete society, the Eastern Province. Today, it is playing a very important role on adapting different means of in technology, in the transition, in the environment. So I think there is a thin line, and I agree that it's very important to ensure that if national champions did exist, they have to be treated definitely in the same way like any other commercial entity, but also they should be role models. They should be used to enable the country, to enable the different industries. And otherwise, they become actually a liability. And I would just give an example. For example, when we started our mining investment law and we started issuing the concessions through auctions, you know, the first auction, I was just, you know, trying to not to bring my emotions, because if the national champion was awarded, it will be thought of as it is something that has been designed. They did not actually. Actually, they didn't win the first auction, and we have to be very also transparent with global players who come to the country. We need to explain what are the role. Even our investors inside Saudi Arabia, they need to understand what is the role. But if you think about it, as Roland just said, I mean, Germany, if you think about it, the large corporations, the likes of Siemens, do not represent the majority. It's the small and medium, the Mittelstand, as you call them in Germany, who actually create the foundation of the sector. And this is the same thing. But you need the big players to enable this, to make sure that the country is moving in the right direction, the right trends are being actually adopted, not to shy away from different technologies, to be role model in every aspect, in human capital, in innovation, in social responsibility, and so on.
Okay, I want to turn to you next, Jonathan, mostly to hear how you're going to stop there being a national champion, and also how much corruption all the way down the supply chain is going to matter to your industrial policy. But before I do, I just want to let the room know you can ask some questions. If you do have a question, please stand up. There'll be some microphones for you. We do have some time for that. So over to you, Jonathan.
I think there's a completely fair challenges, madam. I mean, I'd say, obviously, in the United Kingdom, our historic challenge has not been too many national champions. I mean, it's been, you know, the problem of, for instance, having a tremendous development of offshore wind, and yet it's not been UK companies, to be frank, who benefit from that. You know, so it's similar to about we're looking at it from the opposite, you know, angle on this. But I think the fair challenge Adam makes, you design policy tools that are hopefully trying to give you some insulation and protection from that. I mean, contracts for difference in terms of cost of renewable energy in the UK, transparent auction process, a relationship between public and private sector. They've been successful in one regard in that. I think the conversation around carbon border adjustment mechanisms will reflect this, a lot of interest around the world. But it's, I mean, as you said, I could think, I'm as a politician not going to name companies, that's going to be too difficult for me to do, but, I could think of bilateral negotiations we'll have or have had in the United Kingdom where, essentially there are only so many partners there, and it does make that conversation, I think, a little bit more difficult. In the defence sector, I think it is different, but I do believe there are mechanisms and policy tools available if you use them in the appropriate way, which are giving you some sort of protection from that as best you can.
Okay. I'm just looking around the room. Do we have a question? Yes, there's a hand up there. If you wouldn't mind standing up and saying your name before you ask your question. Oh, she's coming around.
Coming.
Just,
Here comes the microphone.
I'm Michael Strain with the American Enterprise Institute in Georgetown. I think this has been a fantastic conversation. One thing that I think has been missing is kind of practical examples of industrial policy. And in my view, in the United States, which is the country I know best, nearly all of them have been a complete failure for entirely predictable reasons. Like Adam, I wouldn't want to be an absolutist. You can point to some that haven't been, like Operation Warp Speed, for example, which gave the COVID vaccine. Yep. But, decades and decades ago, we tried the Jones Act with shipping. That's been a complete and total disaster. President Trump launched a protectionist regime to support manufacturing employment. That actually ended up reducing manufacturing employment. We have the CHIPS Act right now, which is designed to place semiconductor fabs in swing states in the 2024 presidential election. Those fabs can't find workers. Those fabs are building chips that are out of date.
Laura, I see this directed at you because
I'm trying not to make eye contact with
No, that's okay. Michael and I work on things together. So
Laura and I have had this fight before.
Yes.
I do not. First of all, I'm going to give the great example of the biggest success of industrial policy in the United States, and that is the entire biotech industry. Okay, that's it. We have it. Pharmaceuticals, medical devices. How do we get that? Massive R&D support, massive IP protection, and by the way, massive demand. You can charge anything, and Medicare will say, okay.
That's a problem.
Okay? So basically, that is a perfect example. We created a whole leading industry. Okay. That's number one. Number two,
you might find uncompetitive. Is that correct, Roland?
Number two on chips, just let me say, the companies, where those fabs are built, the companies are involved in making that selection process. I do not think it's for the choices are made by the companies, not by the electoral swing states. It turns out, ironically, that a lot of Biden money, manufacturing money, and CHIPS money is going to go into those states, and they're not going to vote for him. Okay, that's true, but that's not why it's going there. And I think it's early to say that the CHIPS measures are going to fail. I think it's very important to say that a massive amount of the CHIPS money is not building fabs. It's supporting research and development. And to get the U.S. staying at the frontier of technological development in that national security space. So I just don't agree on the current evaluation of the semiconductor policy. Let me just add the one thing, a couple of words which haven't come up here. The dangers of industrial policy are, do you have a government with the administrative capacity to carry it out? The U.S. hasn't had that. Now, I think if you look at what the Department of Commerce has done here, and NIST, which is within the Department of Commerce, and they're setting up this whole nonprofit organization which will actually allocate a lot of the money. They'll allocate the money, so it'll be insulated from political pressure. So, and I'm not going to talk about corruption, just political pressure. You want to insulate the decision-making about where this money goes, and they've set up structures to do that. So, and then, of course, for the tax incentives on the IRA, it's not relevant. I mean, the tax incentives are there. You write them into law, and then they're a form of industrial policy for sure.
So I saw you jumping in very quickly. I want to make sure that your answer also maybe tackles this concept of trickle down, that the people actually feel your industrial policy. Do you want to jump in there, Jonathan?
Well, I think it's an absolutely fair challenge. As a believer in industrial policy, I think some healthy scepticism, it helps the debate. And like any other aspect of policy, it can be good industrial policy, it can be bad industrial policy. But I would say even politicians on what I would describe as the other end of the political spectrum, to me in the UK, even people who say they don't believe in industrial policy, most governments have something that I would say fits that definition. I mean, if you think about go back to the 1980s in the UK, Margaret Thatcher traditionally associated with rolling back the state, very explicit policy to attract Japanese automotive producers to the United Kingdom, which has actually been so successful. It's sustained Brexit, it's still after Brexit, even though really it was based on access to the single market. Financial services sector in the United Kingdom, the Big Bang, but also we've had effectively, I would argue, an industrial policy around greater competition in personal and business banking. It's actually been quite successful. So you can see the trends there, but it can be bad policy. I mean, you have to be able to withstand that challenge and do it. Your question about how people feel the benefits of that, well, look, you have to obviously recognise that I would say even where I see real successes in the US, that doesn't necessarily, even when you've seen real improvements on growth and productivity that we're quite envious of in the UK, it doesn't necessarily filter through to people. So there's an argument about making people understand and how you communicate that and how you essentially, I would hope, build a kind of a consensus around the fundamentals that give some security and stability to policy. But you often see, I would say, the benefits over the longer term than maybe one political cycle. And that is a challenge for businesses and for politicians.
Yeah.
Minister, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I think it's, we need to understand two things. One is policies also have an expiry date, so they don't just last forever. We need to also be mindful of this and move towards, adjustment. And secondly, sometimes it's really an intervention to fix something that is already wrong. I will just give you an example. In our pharmaceutical sectors in Saudi had difficulty to pick up. And the reason behind this is the purchasing habit of the government of Saudi Arabia is not industrial friendly, because the tenders, they come out for 3 years. So if you lose the tender and you lose 80% of the market for 3 years, you are bound to fail. So these are the kind of policies that you need also to address in bringing back the right competitive landscape to ensure that the sector survives. In our petrochemical sector, for example, we had a great policy that made the sector grow, contribute to the global demand, reaching almost 8% of market demand globally. But we could not move the sector to go to downstream. It is because we were unable to find the right policy to pass the incentive or the energy competitiveness. And now we are changing this. So yes, it's a very delicate, and you have to really craft it in a way and follow, understand what is happening. I mean, one of the things also I noticed is that governments in general have a great intention to help, but they are not the best to design the policy. You need the private sector to be part of it, to ensure that once you have the policy, you are testing it before it goes out there. And even if it does, you need to be able to monitor and adjust as you go.
Do we have another? I think we have. Oh, wow, we have a room full of questions. Oh, we've got to get to these ones. Who's getting the mics? Oh, over there.
Thank you. Mr. Posen, you did mention the impact on developing countries and the deployment in developing countries. So one is the U.S. is putting subsidies. Most of these developing countries are fiscally constrained. They can't put subsidies or tax break. Right. It's just not going to work. So what is it they're going to do? Right. Second, the EU is putting more of a price on carbon. And so do you think that then the Ontario were to have the same price of carbon when developing countries did not create the climate change that we have, or they have a lower share? How do you account for their lower share of the contribution in your price of carbon?
I'll start, but number one, if you think about the green industrial policy of the United States, if it succeeds, it's supposed to accelerate, speed, and scale the development of technologies which are helpful to get to net zero. If the U.S. succeeds that way, then essentially you're driving down cost curves, you're driving down price, you're driving down the green premium. Those are products and services which could benefit not just the U.S., but the U.S. as a supplier, as an exporter of these things that will actually be more efficient and cheaper and better because the industrial policy has been a success. So I actually think of the industrial policy to create a stronger green sector, and I'm just using green to cover everything in the United States, actually can have global benefits. It's not distorting. It's actually promoting, it's scaling, it's speeding. As I said, it's going against the green premium. We know that public policy was very important behind what's happened to the price of solar and wind. It didn't happen by market accident. And that, driving down that cost curve, is important not just for the United States, but for the world. And by the way, China was very important here too, because they were helping driving down that cost curve. So it's a global industry, and I think there are benefits.
Adam, do you agree with that?
Only in part.
There you go.
Look, I think there's no question you have technology and going down the cost curve is helpful, but I think we have to be realistic. I mean, if that was really the case, we should all be overjoyed that the Chinese provided all their subsidies to their solar panels.
I'm sort of happy.
We should not, I'm not talking about you, I'm talking about the world. We should not care that the German solar panel industry disappeared or that there's no solar panel industry in the U.S. We should just be buying as many solar panels as fast as possible throughout the world. That's not how the politics has played out. Now, if we could get a set of rules and do those sorts of things, then I'm totally on board with this. Mm-hmm. The other thing is, going with Jonathan's point, which is also very important in the Bidenomics, is the idea of getting the working people buy-in, however you define that. But there's also the getting the developing country buy-in, which is, I believe, what the questioner was referring to. And again, there's fine lines. I mean, we've had Brazil and India blow up constructive trade agreements in the past. So it's not that they're sainted and always right. It's just that when we talk about getting buy-in, and the UNCTAD, was it the UNCTAD? Yeah, I think it was the UNCTAD Director General mentioned this the other day. And I had the Indian Finance Minister speak at the Peterson Institute last April, and she spoke about this. Yeah. That, you know, India sits there and says, well, we want to have an industry.
Yes.
Why shouldn't we have an industry? So then they decide they're going to do subsidies and put up protections against people who can undercut them in costs. And they're going to say, well, if the Europeans put on a CBAM, which for a variety of reasons is a good thing, they're going to say, but that's just to get us to subsidize your green advancement and keep out our so-called dirty things. So we're going to keep out yours until we have green. and no, but I mean, you can go and watch the video of the Indian Finance Minister talking that way. So all I'm trying to say is we have to address these aspects. We can't just have the U.S. sit there and say, we're going to drive down costs and it will trickle down throughout the world. I don't think that's right.
But that isn't what, so the goal of the industrial policy itself is not trickling down to the world. The goal of the industrial policy itself is to create a speed and scale technology for
in the U.S.
Okay, but if you want to add to that, you've got to come up with a set of international policies.
Yes.
Okay, that's all. It's to say that the industrial policy itself, it does have global goals in the sense that it's meant to affect this transition to green. Okay, it does have a global goal. It turns out that a lot of the way the incentives work, it would be to produce that in the United States. That's right. So then the question becomes, all right, what else should the U.S. do, whether it's, for example, in working with the U.S. has very little national. We don't have a Belt and Road. We don't have a fund to go around the world and spread our technology. We don't. So what should we do? I guess I'm saying what should be the complement. It's not that the industrial policy itself is wrong. It just doesn't go far enough to achieve what you want to achieve in the developing world. But that is going to require other things.
At the risk of having the Americans take over the international discussion,
Okay.
I am going to leave it with three non-Americans to, I guess, answer Laura's question in a way. So
Yeah, how do you do it?
how do you do it? How do we make sure that this isn't an American-led industrial policy, that we are seeing, I guess it's not trickle down, as Laura says, but that it is a fairer and also collaborative kind of working environment. So I'm going to not allow the Americans to speak, and I'm going to go to left first with you, Minister. What would you say is the answer to that question?
Well, it's very hard to see we need the consensus on how to do it. And without the US, it will be very hard to imagine such a consensus happening. And then, but definitely, it's very important that also once we do this, we are doing it in a way that is helping other countries address their own pace. And also, and I think what we are missing here is how other countries, other people are doing it, because it's, I mean, if we look at Saudi Arabia, the way we are transitioning, it's quite interesting, but nobody seems to be interested to see what we are doing, because we are delivering actually. So rather than just being trying to put the regulation, and I'm not saying it's not important. In fact, on the contrary, but I say it has to be complemented with the local probably expertise and the local knowledge, and what can others also bring to the table.
Okay. What about from your point of view? How do you counter the great American force here? Or do you need to?
I don't know whether this is the answer. And by the way, I'm not sure whether this healthcare or life science sector is a good example of subsidies, because I'm not aware of any country who has a higher share of GDP in healthcare spendings than the United States.
I was talking about biotech. I wasn't talking about the whole, just biotech.
Because that's a different stuff. This is the same. So, by the way, my take is the following. I think a minimal invasive interference of the government is the right thing to do. So, and it should focus on providing the basics. What are the basics? It's a compliant, secure and stable system, which is very important, so that if you invest, your money pays back and is secure. Secondly, is providing a proper amount of resources, meaning people. I mean, this is about education and training, because this is very centers, including a proper infrastructure, digital infrastructure, logistics infrastructure that we want to have. And then put a frame around, which is giving the right direction. Is it a CO2 price? Is it resilience? Because, I mean, the example on photovoltaics in China, nothing's bad about getting cheap photovoltaic modules. The only point is, if this ends up in another dependency on just one supplier out of one country, it's another story. So if you have that frame and then let the market go, that's maybe a good idea.
Jonathan, last word from you, and that's it. We have to wrap up.
Yeah, it is a superb question. It's one of the outstanding policy challenges, but it is genuinely an area where, as you said, you've got to go beyond industrial policy. I think it's much more about, the financing of that transition in those countries, the cost of borrowing, how debt is treated, how multilateral institutions are reformed to facilitate that. What is maybe the intriguing bit of industrial policy is, are there revenues that will be available in future, revenue streams from things like how a level playing field on carbon might be considered, that would free up resources to do that. But it is an area where you have to go a little bit beyond industrial policy to really get a proper answer to them. Well,
hopefully we'll be on a panel about that next year. So thank you very much for joining me today. Thanks very much. That was great.